Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is John Mullins, and we'll get started here in just one moment. So if you can hear my voice, go ahead and get to your desktop there, get comfortable, and we'll get started here just in one moment. We'll give a few people a chance to get settled in there. Glad you could join us today. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello again, everybody. My name is John Mullins, and you're here today for a short webinar. Hopefully everybody's Wednesday is going really well for you, and this week's going great for you as well. I'm glad you could join us today. Title of today's webinar is 5 Oracle 12c SQL and SQL New Features that you might consider taking advantage of. I just went out there and gathered a handful of new features and thought I'd share them with you today. So some of these might be new to you, all of them might be new to you, or these might be familiar to you as well if you're already working with 12c either in production or non-production, either one there. So we'll get started here in 1 second. All right, let's get rolling. I know your time is very important to you, and I know you've got a lot going on, so I'm going to jump right in here and get started. To get started here, you may notice in your GoToWebinar control panel, there's a couple of tabs in there. One of them is a questions tab, so feel free to post any questions in there. I'll try to get to those. We're on kind of a short time frame, and so sometimes it's difficult for me to do that. You can also send me questions via email as well. And you can see up here on the screen that there's my email address, jmullins@themisinc.com. A couple other things you may notice on the screen there. There's a website there, themisinc.com, where you can go and see some information about classes that might be related to this webinar, or all our webinars, the slides and the recordings get posted out there at that website as well. There'll be a tab at the top for webinars, or you can go to themisinc.com/webinars and get a copy of today's presentation and such. Also, you can follow us on Twitter as well at Themis Training. Okay, just a few places you can get a hold of us there. All right, here's a bit of information about my background and such. I've noticed a lot of your names look familiar to me from people that may have attended some of my either previous webinars or previous classes out there. But again, my name's John Mullins. I'm coming to you from Texas today. Some of you already know that, where it's going to be about 88 degrees today, kind of humid, but the weather looks pretty good. I've been using Oracle since version 5, so 5.1.22 was my start back in the early 80s, and has started off as a developer programmer at Boeing, and then worked for various consulting companies and training companies since then. I am a Oracle certified professional DBA, and I'm also a certified technical trainer, so you know from my classes that I like to keep the classes, while fairly structured, also pretty laid back as well. And I've had the opportunity to teach a lot of classes over those 30 years also. Just a little bit about you know where I'm coming from. And I'm representing Themis. They've been around for a long time. A lot of you have taken classes from Themis before, or have gotten emails advertising those classes. We've taught well over 90,000 students over the years, and we teach classes in all kinds of areas, DB2, SQL Server, Oracle, the database stuff, but also things that are related to that, Unix, Linux, .NET, and so on. So again, you can go out to themisinc.com and get that information, and I'll give you some other contact information at the end of today's webinar. All right, related to today's webinar, here's just a kind of a list, a little bit of a list of classes that are kind of related to what we're talking about today. So we do have some new features type classes, which are hands-on. So you can take those either at a public site or at your site or online as well with a live instructor. So there's just a few related classes for you. Like I said, these slides will be available out on our website, themisinc.com/webinars. They're not out there yet, though, so give us a little bit of time. We'll post those out there. All right, so what are we here today? Like I said, I gathered just a handful of some 12c new features that are related to SQL and PL SQL, so kind of steered away from the DBA type stuff that is specific to DBAs anyway, and I wanted to focus on some of the language new features here. All right, so let's jump right in here and see. What I've kind of done is kind of every other one's going to be SQL or PL SQL here. And like I said, if you have any questions, put them in the question box, but it kind of works best if you want to save those and email those to me, you can. Again, my email address is jmullins@themisinc.com. So the first one here, and some of these will be very simple. Some of these you've already seen before. Some of them might be new to you. So I'm going to start off with an SQL new feature. Boy, we've been waiting for this one for a while, haven't we? Top-end queries. You know, show me the top 5 of this, the top 3 of that, whatever it might be. You know, in the past, you'll see an example of how we kind of tackled this in the past. And just here in just a moment. But this, we're going to introduce this fetch first type of clause to our query here in just a moment. And we can go out and get the first X number of records, and that can be based on number of records, first percentage of records. We can have an offset clause that will allow us to skip so many records first and then display the next so many records. And this is part of the American National Standards Institute, their standard for SQL. So a lot of people, the other vendors like IBM and Microsoft in DB2 and SQL Server, they've had this kind of clause for a while now, so it's good for Oracle now to be adding it as well. And this is going to, you know, make our code a little bit easier as far as writing it goes. All right, here's a little table that I'm just going to be using in some of the demonstrations, or not demonstrations, but examples today. I have a table called daily attendance. This might be a table for like a museum or a sports park or an amusement park or something like that, where they keep track of attendance. You know, and for the people that keep track of attendance, they're looking for trends out there. You know, is the attendance going up? Is it going down? When does it go down? What kind of patterns are in place? And so we might use this to identify that. We're going to use this one for some of our other new features as well, but keep this in mind. We have an attendance date and we have attendance there. All right, so here's the problem first. We want to return the 5 attendance dates with the highest attendances. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's what we're trying to accomplish here. If we look up here at the top, this is one way we may have done it in the past. If we look at the first example, select star from, and then in our from clause, we have a subquery where we're doing an order by in descending order. Okay. So here we're ordering by attendance in descending order, where the row num is less than or equal to 5. And that's the way we may have done it in the past in 11G or earlier. That's one way we could have done it. But here in 12C, you can see the arrow on here. It's going to simplify our query a little bit. There's not going to be a subquery involved with this. So we're just going to do a select asterisk from daily attendance, order by attendance in descending order. And then in this case, we're doing it by rows. We're just going to say fetch first 5 rows only. Okay, and we're going to see a couple of different options we can do with this fetch first clause as well. Okay, so hang on for those, but we'll take a look at those here in just a minute. You can see the results we get down here at the bottom. Okay. So if some of you have been using DB2 before or such, you may have seen this before, or as you're now testing in with Oracle 12c. So everybody right now is probably using 12c release 1. I've seen some reports out there that says 12c release 2 will be released sometime mid-year this year. So June or July is the expectation for release 2. This is available in release 1 for you right away. All right, here's a little bit different. I'm going to show you a couple different variations of the fetch first or fetch next clause here. So we can also do it with ties. So, we may, on the first one, we get just the first 5. Here, if we get down to that 5th record there that's part of that result set in this case, if there's a tie there, we're not necessarily going to see it unless we add the with ties here. Remember, the first one said fetch first 5 rows only. This one says with ties. Okay, and like I said, this one's probably the simplest feature we're going to look at today, but it's still a really good one to be aware of, that it could change the way we code a lot of our code. Depending on your business and your job role and such, there's a lot of people that are out there, especially like in maybe a data warehouse environment or such, that are out there doing queries like this. Give me the top 10 of this. I want to know who are my top 10 customers based on sales or orders placed, or who are my top 10 customers based on calls into the help desk, things like that. It helps me improve my business. So here's one with ties, and like I said, this first one's pretty simple, so I'll go through it pretty quickly. All right, here's one with percent, so fetch first 3% rows only. All right, so instead of basing it on the number of rows, we can base it on a certain percentage of rows. All right, you can see how that's done there. So again, something very simple to do, but yet very powerful. And remember, it allows us to not have to write a subquery. Some of us will be more comfortable writing subqueries than others. And remember, we may not be familiar with that row num pseudo column. But remember, the row num pseudo column gets assigned to records in the result set prior to any sorting that happens. So this kind of takes care of that issue for us as well. All right, how about an offset clause? So maybe I've already fetched the first 5 rows, or the first 3 rows, or the first 10 rows, and now I want to go beyond that to the next group of rows. So here I can do an offset clause and say, go offset, in this case, 5 rows, so skip the first 5 rows and give me the next 3 rows only. And again, you could do it with ties, or you could do a percentage of rows after you do the offset, whatever you want to do there. Okay, so there's the offset there. And a lot of times you may have coded with this type of stuff in the past, where maybe you used a PL SQL program with a cursor, and you did something similar to that. This is going to be a lot less code to do the same thing. All right, so our first feature there was the fetch first, which kind of takes the place of us having to do a subquery in the from clause with a sort on descending there. So I like that one a lot. It's really simple, and that's okay. We'll take the simple ones too, won't we? All right, let's go on to the next one here. And like I said, these are all going to be available at themisinc.com/webinars. Just give us a little bit of time to get the slides posted out there. Also, a recording will be out there that you can link to as well. All right, this one's kind of a combo SQL PL SQL new feature. And some of you may already be familiar with doing a with clause, or sometimes it's called a subquery factoring clause. So you have a with clause with an SQL select statement. And what we've been used to prior to 12c is what? Putting subqueries up in the with clause. Well, now in 12c, in addition to subqueries up there, we can also put functions and procedures up in the with clause, rather than creating them and storing them in the database. Okay, so I'll show you an example of that here. Now, why would we want to include, these are basically inline functions or inline procedures right in there with our SQL code? Well, for one, we don't have to, if we don't have the privileges to do creating procedures or functions, it gets us around that, so we don't have to have somebody with those privileges, namely a DBA or somebody else, perform that activity for us. So we get around that. Plus, by the statement you're really running with the with clause is an SQL statement, and if we're going to call a function or a procedure, or namely a function really, from an SQL statement, we're going to have a context switch when that happens, when we go from SQL to PL SQL. The SQL engine doesn't understand PL SQL, and PL SQL engine doesn't understand SQL. So by embedding the code right here within the SQL statement, we avoid that. Okay, and that's a good thing performance-wise. The negative to doing this is, since the procedure or function isn't actually created as a separate object, it's not going to be shareable from other pieces of code that's out there. So let's take a look at an example here. All right, should be able to see that up on your screen there. So if you notice down here in the select statement, I've got select ename and annual comp. Annual comp's my function name, and I'm passing it a monthly salary and a commission for all my employees. Now, annual comp could have been a separate function created that's an individual object itself that we call there, or you can see here with the with, we can include that right here in this SQL statement itself. So I said here in my with clause, function annual comp, and there's the entire function all the way down to the end statement. You can still have subqueries up there. In a minute, I'll show you one with a store procedure as well. What this allows you to do is when I hit this select down here, this annual comp, it doesn't have to go over to the PL SQL engine to execute that, since it's not a separate PL SQL object. Since it's here, it's embedded in the SQL. And think about how many times this function is going to run here. I said from emp, and there's no where clause, so it's going to run once for every row that select returns, which in this case would be if there's 14 records in that emp table. So we can put function definitions up here in the with clause. We can put store procedures up there. So let me show you. Here's an example of the second one with a procedure in it. So up here I have a procedure add data, and it's going to take some input parameters and pass back a total here. So it just takes the monthly salary and the commission, puts them into a calculation to calculate an annual compensation, stores it in an output parameter called p total, and then I have a function that follows right after it. So you can see how we do this. It's kind of like a package body, if you want to look at it that way, where we've got just code after code or program after program listed in the package body there. And so here we've got a function, and in the function what happens? We're going to call the procedure. All right. And then our select statement down at the bottom is exactly the same as in the previous example. All right, so we call the function here, it calls the function, we're passing to the function a salary and a commission. The function then, and this is just an example to demonstrate what you can do. It isn't necessarily a good example, but it is an example that shows the capabilities of this new feature. And then the function calls the procedure with the monthly salary and the commission, and the procedure takes that, throws them in a calculation, passes back the total through an output parameter, which then the function then returns in its return statement. All right. So again, this is the first PL SQL new feature I wanted to show you today. This is having procedures and functions in your with clause. So remember the pluses and minuses to that. All right, very good. All right, let's look at our third one here. Okay, and this one's probably maybe the more complicated of the 5 that we'll see today. All right, this one's an SQL new feature, and this has to do with what's called row pattern matching. All right, and notice what we've got going on here. We're going to search for pattern matches that are within a column but across rows. Okay, now you think of pattern matching, you might think of like the like operator, where you say where, last name like, and then some conditions there, %E, whatever it is there. And in that case there, you're looking for patterns, but within a single column or string or whatever, within one row at a time. Here we're going to look across rows. So you can see some of the usages that might be for it. I'm going to show you 2 different examples, and there's lots of different examples out there. But you can see what we might look for trends. So is the data for a particular column, is it going up? Is it going down? How long has it been going down for? Things like that. That'll be kind of our first example here we'll look at in just a second. What are the patterns that we're looking for? We can identify the pattern that we're looking for and for how many matches we need in order for some data to be displayed in the result set. So there's lots of different usages for this. And like I said, it can get pretty complicated. but it's not too bad. Let's take a look at some examples here that'll get us going. All right, now as we jump into this first example, here's some of the keywords you'll see in the code there. So the match recognize clause, this is what allows us to do the pattern search in the first place. Okay, so this starts our code. It's going to be part of a select statement, as you'll see. The match recognize, we need that to basically tell it, hey, I'm going to do some pattern matching here. Without that, we can't do it. Okay, the partition by, that's just like kind of like a group by, if you're used to that. So, you know, depending on what we're looking for, our second example will have a partition by in it. We may want to group data together first and then start looking for patterns in that grouped data. All right. Now, typically, since we're comparing, you know, a pattern from one row to a pattern in another row, we're probably going to do an order by in here. All right. So to kind of get stuff, we might do an order by a date if we're looking for patterns from one day to the next day or something like that. So a lot of the times we're going to have an order by as part of this. And this order by here is separate from the order by from your main query, from your main select. This is, I need to sort the data first before I can look at the patterns. And as patterns match, I may decide to sort it differently with the order by from the select. All right, the measures clause, this is where we're going to define the value that might be calculated for each match found. Now, it could be, we might be doing if we find a match, we might do a calculation, or if we find a match, we might just display it. And so the measures will do either one. Today, in our two examples, the measures is just going to display our matches. But we could take the matches and maybe sum them up or count how many matches we have. That's where we do that. We do that in the measures clause there. All right, and then within there, we're going to kind of decide, okay, every time I hit a match, am I going to display each individual row that gets matched, or do I want to do a summary of those matches? And that's what we call the row pattern rows per match clause or option here. And you'll see an example of that coming up. A couple more here real quick, and then we'll see the example. The pattern clause, this is what you're looking for. This is the pattern you're looking for. What are you looking for? You might be looking for where the date from one record is less than the date from a previous record, or in this case, we're going to go back to that attendance table where attendance from one day is less than the attendance from a previous day. Maybe we're looking for declining attendance. It might be because of weather. If our business is an outside thing, it might be because of the economy. It might be because of some event, whatever that might be. So the pattern is, that's what we're looking for there. And then the define clause, that's where our conditions for the pattern are defined. So in other words, you know, how many rows do I need to match to make this a pattern? In other words, is it just one row? If I match from one row to the next row, is that good enough? Or do I have to go from one row, and before I have a successful match, it has to be 3 rows? So in other words, I don't want to see if my attendance goes down just one day in a row, I don't care. But if my attendance goes down 3 or 4 or 5 days in a row, then that's what I want to see in my report potentially. All right, so lots of different clauses there for us to consider. So let's take a look at the example. And we talked about the measures and the pattern here. Here's some specifics to those. Remember, the measures is defining, you know, what's going to be displayed or calculated and then displayed there. So we can see, you know, what's the first record of the match, what's the last record of the match, those types of things. And then the pattern is part of that define clause. In other words, here you have an asterisk, you have curly brackets with an N, curly brackets with an M, and I'm going to have one here that has curly brackets with a number in it, like a 3. Which means, what do I want to match to? Do I want to match to 0 or more matches, 1 or more matches, exactly 3 matches? You know, what am I trying to match here? And you may have seen some of these if you've used some of the other languages that are out there already have this kind of feature built into it. particularly like scripting type languages, you may have seen some of these, what do they call, iteration quantifiers out there. All right, let's jump right into the example here. All right, daily attendance. Find patterns of declining attendance of 3 straight days. Okay, remember our attendance table, what it looked like. It had an attendance date, and then it had the attendance for that day. That's all it had. So you can see, looking at the code right away, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, this looks like a mess right here, right? Well, look what we're doing here. We're just selecting asterisk from daily attendance. So we're getting all the dates and all the attendances for those dates. All right, and then I give it a match recognize, which starts with an open paren, will eventually end with a closed paren down at the bottom. That says, what's inside those parentheses. Here's my, this is allowing me to look for those pattern matches. And then I want to order by date because I want to look for declining attendance for 3 straight days. So I need to do a sort there on attendance date, in this case in ascending order by default. Remember, the measures clause is basically what I'm going to end up displaying. So I'm going to display the attendance date. I'm going to display the low attendance, which, remember, we have these methods or functions like last and down and first and so on. Okay, and then I also want to throw in there the low date as well. All right, we've got the 1 row per match, so I'm not summarizing these. As I get these, I want to display them and use them in my output there. And then after I get a match, what do you want me to do next? In this case, then there's a few things you can do. Here I'm going to say after match, skip to the next row and start looking for the next match. All right, you could, after match, you could start with the last item you matched. Here it's skipping to the next item. So there's lots of different things you can do there. Basically that's just saying, once I get the match, where do I start the next search? All right, and then we get into the pattern. Remember, the pattern is what we're looking for. Okay, and typically you're going to use aliases here, and the aliases are going to be defined down here in your define clause. And by default, if you don't specify an alias, it gets a name of A. So what in this case here, what A is saying is that whatever row I'm currently looking at, I'm going to look for the pattern, however I have it defined up above. I'm going to look for the pattern, and I'm going to go down from there. And remember what the curly brackets mean here. The curly brackets in this case with the 3 mean I'm going to go down exactly 3 rows. So I'm looking for exactly 3 matches for the pattern that I have defined in the define clause. So what do I have down here? I have an alias called down. So what am I looking for? For a particular record, I'm looking at the attendance, and for that record, if it's less than the previous attendance, that one counts. Now, that one is not going to be displayed because what am I doing? I'm looking for 3 in a row of this definition. So if I get a match, it'll then go down to the next record. You can see right here it says after match, skip to next row, go down to the next one. Is its attendance less than the previous? Oh, now I got 2. And if the next one is in case, then now I have 3. And now that becomes part of my output. What will my output look like? It's going to display the attendance date. That's what's up in the measures clause. Okay. So remember, the define is the pattern you're looking for. And it can be very simple like this one is, or very complicated as well. All right, you're going to have aliases down here. Down is defined as this, that my attendance for the row I'm looking at is less than the previous. Okay, when we do that and run that, you can see here's the results we get. So here's the high date and the low date and the low attendance. That's the low attendance. Oops, let me go back there. The low attendance for this low date. So the high date was January 11th. Maybe the attendance was 7,000. And now I start looking for the pattern. What's the attendance on the 12th, the 13th, and 14th? Did I get 3 days in a row of declining attendance? And if I did, display that record, whatever's in the measures clause. Okay, so that's our first example there. Let's take a quick look at our second example. It's a little bit simpler, I think. Here we have a table called CC transactions, or stands for credit card transactions here. And let's take a look. Here's what it looks like. So I have a transaction ID, I have a credit card number, I have a transaction amount for that credit card, I have a date for that transaction, and then I have a state code here. All right, so then this particular example, what we're trying to find are, and I've gotten a phone call on this before, and for those of you that travel a lot like myself, you may run into these as well. This says find patterns where the same credit card number was used physically in two different locations, in this case locations defined as a state, maybe a country, on the same day. So living in Texas, a lot of times I'll travel, and I got a call once. I was up in the New York area, and I got a phone call from the credit card company saying, hey, or first I got a decline on it first, and then I called them and they said, hey, yeah, we noticed you had a transaction within 3 hours on the same day from two different states, and we would just wanted to verify that that was indeed a good transaction before we processed it. Okay, so that's what we're kind of looking for in this particular query here. All right, there's going to be a lot of things in this one that's similar to the first one. We're selecting from the transaction table for the credit cards. We do the match recognized. Now here I'm going to do a partition by credit card number because within the same date, that credit card, it could have been used multiple times on the same day. It could have been used multiple times across days. So I'm going to do basically a group by the credit card number, and then within that group I'm going to do an order by those records by date. So a lot like a group by, right? Group by the credit card number, and then within those groupings order by the transaction date and the transaction state. What I'm going to display at the end is just a credit card number. Remember, that's the measures clause, and the date that these matches happen on. Remember, what I'm looking for is on the same date my credit card was used physically, not over online or on the internet, but physically from two different locations, states in this case. One row per match, and then after each match I'm going to skip to the next row, and then the pattern I'm looking for here is going to be, you see this A plus, A, and then B plus. Remember, these different characters mean different things. So A just means, if I don't have anything else with the A, it just means the row I'm currently on, what do I need to match to? Well, I need to match whatever the definition of B is, which if we look down here in the define, what is B? B is equal to this. I take the transaction date, or the transaction date in this case, I'm comparing it for one record to the previous record's date. If I get a match on the dates and the states are different. All right, so here's a transaction on May 1st. It matches to the previous record, which was May 1st. Okay, so the transactions on the same date, two different transactions, are they in the same state or not? And that's what I'm looking for. That's the definition of B. So here it says A means what? I'm going to take the record I'm currently on, and I need to match to one or more. Remember, the plus sign means one or more rows. So a row, which is A, matches one or more rows that are B, and B equals the dates are equal, but the states are different. Okay, and that's what we're saying here in this pattern down here. So if you see a letter by itself, it just means I'm looking at the current record. So the current record has to match to one or more other records, because I could have more than one transaction on the same date, even in different states. Especially you guys that live up in the Northeast, everything's so close together up there, right? And so the credit card companies may or may not consider that, but I can go from New York to Connecticut to New Jersey, all within an hour. Living here in Texas, I can drive from my house 11 hours to the northwest and still be in Texas. All right, so sometimes the credit card companies will keep track of this thing, especially if you go out of country. But they also do it by state. I've gotten calls on that. So here's another example of that here. Remember, these are good examples. If you haven't used them before, just make sure you get a copy of our slides from today. And here's the output from that. I just printed out the credit card number and the date where the match occurred. In other words, the date where I had multiple transactions, but they were from different states. Okay? All right, let's go to a PL SQL one here. All right, and this is called Subprogram Whitelist. And this is a new feature, again, in 12c, just like all these are. What this is going to allow us to do gives us that kind of added layer of security that we can have in our PL SQL programs, whether they be functions or procedures or whatever. So we're going to define, within a program, we're going to define what other PL SQL program units have access to this program. And a lot of times we'll do that maybe in a package in the past. So if we don't list something in the package specification, but we put it in the body because maybe it's a program that we only want to run from when it's called from another program, we may have done that in a package in the past. With the accessible by clause, we don't need to do that anymore if that's what we choose not to do. Or we could still do it in the package, but give us this extra layer on top of all the other securities that are out there. So here's an example of that. Here I have a function called, this is the same one we had before, annual comp, and it's going to call a stored procedure, okay, just like we had before. Now take a look here at the procedure down at the bottom. It's the same procedure as we had before, but now I'm going to add this line that the arrow is pointing to right here, the accessible by. So if this says this procedure is going to be accessible by this program, and if you have multiple programs, you can just put commas in there. So in other words, it's not going to, when I try to run this procedure directly and not through the annual comp function, I should get an error message. This says this procedure can only be run when called from this program called annual comp. So there's my two programs there. Now when I try to execute that, so up here on the next page, you'll see I have a little anonymous block here, and I'm just trying to call the store procedure by itself directly without going through the function. This is with the accessible by clause in it. And you can see the message I get. And I'm even the owner of these programs. I created these directly, so I'm not even somebody else who's just been granted execute on them. I'm actually the owner of add data and annual comp, and so it's still preventing me from doing this. And you all have programs that kind of fall into this category, right? Where it makes no sense to call this program directly because it needs input from some other program. So if I call it directly, it might run, or I might have to do a little workaround on what the data input is into it, but I might get the wrong results too. So notice the error message I get down here. Insufficient privilege to access object add data. Okay, and that's all because of that, if I go back here, all because of this accessible by clause right here on the annual comp. If I leave that out, then I can still run the add data directly there. All right, now if I go ahead and I run the procedure that gets called from annual comp here, I'm just doing select annual comp, which in turn will call add data. You can see it works just perfectly fine. Okay, so in this case, what we're calling a white list is the accessible list. In a program, we define how this program can be accessed. Can it be accessed directly, or does it have to be accessed from other programs? All right, so we call that a subprogram whitelist there. All right, last one. So hang in there, we're almost done here. How about something that has kind of a cool name, invisible columns? Right? We saw in 11G we had something called an invisible index, but here we're looking at an invisible column. All right, and so here within our table definitions or views, we can make columns invisible. Okay, and so once we make them invisible at that point, for statements that do not reference the columns directly, they won't see them. Now you can still reference the column directory. I'll show you an example here in just a second, and still get to it. So it's not hiding the column from every type of statement that may want to try to access it, but just certain types of statements. All right, so we can make the column invisible when we create a table, later on with an alter table, or through views there too. Now, what's the benefits to making a column invisible? If we add columns, say, to a table as part of a process that's going on there, you can see the benefits listed on the slide there. So we're introducing a change like adding a column, whatever. But we're going to minimize any negative side effects, because if we have code that just does a select asterisk, or if we have PL SQL code that uses the % row type attribute, they won't see that column that was added. So those programs aren't affected by that new column that was added there. Only the programs that explicitly want to see the column will actually still be able to see it even though it's invisible. All right, so let's look at an example here. All right, so here's our first example. We did an alter table, and I'm changing the salary column because it's sensitive data. I'm making it invisible. Right? And there's, you guys all know probably, there's other ways to hide columns from users or from code, right? We can do it through views by only selecting certain fields and then granting select on those views. We could pay for, Oracle has some advanced security features where we could do the same thing there, but those are typically an extra license, an extra cost. And so here's a way for us to kind of do similar type of thing here, but it's not an extra license, for example. I see questions there about can we use the accessible by clause in a function? The answer is yes. Okay. All right, so here's what I got. Notice I made a column invisible. So I did, in this case, I would just happen to be an SQL plus. I did describe on the table, and look what I get. The salary column does not show up. Okay, because I didn't explicitly say I wanted to see the column that I made invisible there. All right, if we look at the next example here, if I do a select asterisk from the table, there's no salary there either. But notice the second select, I selected explicitly the salary field. I said select ename and sal from department number and then from that table, and now I get the salary field. Okay. So remember, the main reason for this particular feature is to minimize impacts of certain database changes. So that if your program just goes out like with a select asterisk or uses the %row type and people are changing columns, that they're not going to be affected by this. But I might have some new programs that I want to see the new added column, but they're going to explicitly state the column name like Sal in this place. Okay? So that's what invisible columns are all about. Right? So you won't necessarily run into these unless you're in the middle of a project and the database or the table definitions aren't in concrete yet. So you're in your non-production environment maybe at this point, and we've made some slight database changes there. In that case there, then those programs that don't directly access the column, they're not affected by the change. The programs that want to work with it, they'll directly access it, and they're okay. And I noticed there was a question there about the column showing up in the user tab columns view. And yes, it should show up there. So in the 12c version of that particular view, there should be a hidden column in that view. So it'll either say yes or no for the hidden column in that particular view. You asked about can we insert data into invisible column, and the answer is yes. Okay, so the invisible column, it's still there. It still has data. It's just hidden from certain types of statements. That's all. So yeah, we can insert into it. We can update, whatever on that as well. Okay. All right, so that's how the invisible columns work there. I see a question there about how the pattern match queries affect query performance as well. Well, anytime you add any complexity, you guys know this, anytime you add any complexity to a query, I'm comparing one row and certain fields within that row to another row looking for patterns. So it's almost like you're doing that explicit cursor in a PL SQL program where you fetch a row, put its data in some variables, and you compare it to the previous row. Yeah, pattern matching is going to add some negative performance on this, depending on the pattern you're looking for and how complicated the pattern is, and depending on how many records that you're trying to look for this pattern across, yeah, it's going to run slower just like any other query would. If you try to compare it to maybe other ways to do the same thing, whether you're going to load stuff into a PL SQL program and then load this data into maybe collections or arrays and then process those through loops, you're probably going to see a similar performance. So I don't know that all the different alternative ways to do this, that this way is going to be any slower, and we'll say it this way as well, or faster than any of the other ways. But yeah, those are great questions there. All right, here's a couple of other, just, oh, by the way, here's some other 12c new features in SQL. I'm not going to go through these today because that would make our number more than 5, right? But there's a cascading truncate statement. Now you can have the cascade option on there. And then there's also identity columns that you can add as a definition to a table as well. And these are like your primary key columns. Typically, what have we done in the past? We've used sequences. And those sequences were assigned to a primary key, maybe during an insert statement, maybe inside a trigger, something like that. Here we can actually do it as part of the table definition. This basically generates or creates a sequence that's directly tied to that column. Okay, here I'm calling it as identity, as my sequence name type of thing, rather than creating a separate sequence which is independent of any objects. This one's now tied to an object, in this case the transaction ID in this particular table. Okay. All right, so those are some of the 12c SQL. And then lastly here's some of the PL SQL other features that we didn't talk about today. So there is a UTL call stack program, a brand new one there. It's part of the DBMS utility package. Some of you may have used some of the programs in that package before. This is kind of consolidating some of those other programs into a single program here. But it does very similar work, like it'll return the line number where an error might have occurred at. It'll return an error message. So you may have used other programs for that in the past. They're just consolidating them here. If anybody uses the DBMS scheduler package to schedule batch jobs or whatever, we know that there's kind of a limit on the different types of things you could schedule. Like before, you could schedule a stored procedure or an executable, for example. Now you can also just schedule SQL scripts, which we could work around and do that otherwise. But here, they're going to give us a new type, which will simplify that greatly there. And then there's also a new layer of security where we can actually grant a role to a function or procedure, for example. So in addition to granting people execute on it, and we have invoker rights where are we going to inherit the privileges necessary to run the procedure and the objects that it accesses. We can also then grant privileges through a role to the program itself. So you can look more into that also if you want there. Okay. I see a couple of other questions up there as we get ready to wrap up here about materials for this particular webinar today, and then the identity column being a problem when loading tables. I don't expect that there would be any problems during the load of the tables. As it works kind of the same way as if you had a trigger based on, let's say, insert. So maybe a before insert trigger on a particular table, and the purpose of the trigger was to assign the value of a sequence to the primary key column. This is kind of doing the same thing for you, but you don't need the trigger to do it. Okay, some of the nice things about the trigger versus this feature that we saw on the previous page, you can disable triggers and kind of work around, and that can be helpful in certain situations where this is part of the table definition. In order to change this, you'd have to change the data that's in the table there. I see the question there about data. There's already data in the table. And in that case there, the trigger, the the identity columns keeping track of. It's just another sequence, but now it's tied directly to the column rather than being independent. Think of it that way. So it's going to work exactly the same way before as sequences work. So you know kind of the problems you have where, especially if you delete data and then you add data back in, or you're going to start where you left off. If you have to start over, and basically in that case there you're going to have to, you're going to have to drop the table and recreate it, where with a sequence you'd have to do kind of the same thing. If you wanted to start over with a new start with value, you'd have to drop the sequence and then recreate it with a new start with. Start with's the only option that you can't alter in a sequence. All right, there's my email address there, jmullins@themisinc.com. I see that last question in the box there about where can we go to get materials, and those will show up here in just a second. Those will be loaded out on our website here shortly, so they won't be out there right away. If you go to themisinc.com/webinars, and I'll put that in the question box over there. So let me put that over there real quick. themisinc.com/webinars. It's going to show up on the next slide here as well. But you can go there, and there you can get copies of the slides, and there also will be a link to the recording of today's webinar. Okay. Also, notice there's a couple of upcoming webinars coming on. These are DB2 related. So if you're also a DB2 person, or you have some coworkers in other groups, let them know about these. There's one on June 15th and one on August 17th. You can see the titles there, and they'll be in the slides if you happen to download those as well. And then lastly, if you need any other information, feel free to go out to themisinc.com. There you'll see a list of all the classes we offer. There's a link at the top for webinars. Some of the past webinars will be listed there. So I've done quite a few. There's quite a few out there for DB2 and Java and things like that. You can contact John Cacavel, who's a coworker of mine, and he'd be glad to give you more information. There's his email address and phone number. And again, go out to themisinc.com/webinars to get a copy of the slides and the recorded presentation from today. So today we talked about 5 kind of features. I just kind of grabbed them out of a bag. Thought they were kind of interesting. Hopefully you found them interesting as well. I'll let you guys go at this point. If you have any questions down the line, again, email me at jmullins@themisinc.com. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you again for attending today, and everybody have a good rest of your day on Wednesday and a good rest of your week. Got Memorial Day weekend, so enjoy your holiday. Everybody be safe, and I'll talk to you soon in a future webinar or class.